2, 1. Good morning and welcome into the Mike and Mike podcast. We are so thankful that you are joining us. However, whenever and wherever you are joining us, we're thankful that you're here as we continue to talk about Christians at work. And we have specifically over the last several of these sessions been talking about individuals and what we can learn from their stories and how they were successful both in business and spiritually. As I'll try to give the disclaimer this morning that Michael normally does, that we understand that the spiritual principles absolutely are first and foremost and paramount, and they're things that you can't help but hit on in here. But we're also looking for the business principles, which absolutely are secondary, but we think there's some things that can help us be a little bit better. So with that disclaimer in mind, Mr. Ray, how's everything in beautiful Somerset today?
Everything is well, thank you. It's a beautiful morning. I've got my coffee, and you've got your Bang energy, and so why wouldn't we should be raring to go this morning?
At least by the end, for sure.
Give it a minute to kick in. Right. This is a good morning for those of us who fall into the conflict avoidance, which I'm kind of in that bucket. And so if you like to avoid confrontation, maybe this is the study for you this morning. But it is a lot about conflict, and so we're going to talk about a character that we're probably familiar with, but an account that is maybe a little more obscure, but I think has some business principles. So we're going to talk about Isaac and some wells this morning, I think, is our intent.
Gotcha. Yeah, and for those of you that are maybe a little bit unfamiliar with how we got here, where this thing falls, we're in Genesis 26 is where the bulk of our story is going to take place. But Michael, how do contextually for those that are less familiar with Isaac and the wells, how do we get to Genesis 26, and where does that fit in the overall context of the book of Genesis?
Sure. And so as we were last week, we're in this period of human history between the flood and the law of Moses, and so we're in this patriarchal period, and of course a lot of that has to do with the life of Abraham and his descendants, and we're still in that mode. We talked about Laban last week and his dealings with Jacob, and now we're with Jacob's father, Isaac. It's interesting that in the scope of Isaac's life, a lot of the things that he goes through, they don't. Again, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes, they say. And Isaac's life certainly rhymes a lot with Abraham's. He goes through a lot of similar things, and we see some of that this morning. We know that Abraham in his life dealt with Abimelech, which is kind of a generic name of a king of the Philistines. And so here we also see in Genesis 26 that Isaac is dealing with a king, Abimelech, from the Philistines. So, big picture, Isaac is we'll say middle-aged or to later in his life, and he is making his own way. He is his father Abraham was well known and well respected, but he's now making his own way. In the course of his own life, for those who kind of have a feel for things that happened, the Esau and Jacob, Esau selling his birthright for a pot of stew, that has just happened in the previous chapter. Those twins are of some age now, and it doesn't appear as though they've left home yet. Jacob hasn't departed for Laban yet, but again, Isaac is up in his middle age. These are his earning years, so to speak, if we want to put it into our context. And so God comes to him in the beginning of chapter 26, and it seems like even though God had this promised land and this promise for Abraham and Isaac, he had to continually provoke them or continually convince them to stay in this land. Abraham wandered about and went to Egypt at one point, and Isaac apparently was thinking about doing the same, because God tells him directly, don't go to Egypt, hang out here. You're going to be a sojourner. This is not going to be your land for now. but this is where I want you to hang out, and this is where you're going to prosper. And there's probably some spiritual implications on that for us, but that's the message that God told him. And the background of the whole story really hinges on understanding the importance of wells of water in primitive Palestine. This is a arid area where this land is ultimately is called Beersheba, and that is still a city that exists in present day Israel, and to my understanding, somewhat similar to the area that we're talking about. But we're talking about the southern part of present day Israel, and in a more arid, the Negev desert region. So if the name of the city Beersheba, which is where we'll get to at the end of the story, if that city sounds familiar to you, it's because throughout the Old Testament, when God or one of the prophets was trying to talk about the scope of the land that God had given, it was often said, well, from Dan to Beersheba. That was kind of the Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon kind of breadth of talking about how much land Israel had. So Dan in the north and Beersheba in the south, and so we're in the southern part of Israel. But it is this arid area, and in order to have any kind of prosperity or accumulation, in order to settle in any way, you had to have a well. If you're going to have flocks, if you're going to have any semblance of civilization where there are many people, or even some people living domiciled, stable in an area, there had to be a supply of water that was constant, and sometimes that was difficult in these arid areas. You might remember that Isaac, his wife was found where at a well. That's where the servant found his wife. And so that the wells were incredibly important, and they were, I don't even know what the modern equivalent is. They were an incredibly important resource or source of prosperity, and you couldn't really have a civilization without them. And so again, I don't know what the modern equivalent is.
Well, I think the modern equivalence is it's really somewhat the same, right? If you look at the United States in pre-industrialization, right, where were all the cities settled? Along waterways, right? Waterways both for the resource and for the transportation. It's no surprise to anyone if you kind of mapped out the largest cities where you find them along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, right? Kind of New York, and you flow down and through Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, down through Louisville, all the way down to Louisiana. So, those cities that found themselves along the river, and river waterways is always an important resource. Um, just an interesting, random bit of trivia here with this. Michael mentioned, about wells. This is not, I don't want to take up a bunch of time for this, but um, a lot of people meet their wives by wells. Isaac and Rebecca, Jacob and Rachel, he's coming to the well. If you just pay attention a little bit, the next time you're reading through, wells are everywhere. They're a popular meeting spot because everybody's got to come and draw water. But a lot of significant things happen at the well. One that probably most of you will be familiar with is Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well in the New Testament. But when you it's interesting, as we started out this study, doing some reading for some other classes I'm working on, just these wells just keep popping up, and for exactly what Michael pointed out, that this is a important natural resource. The only other thing I would say is probably akin to for us, and it's almost access is to oil. It's, I mean, this well was energy. Not that you've got to be close to an oil well today, but if you don't have access to fossil fuels, I mean, good luck running your business. And while I don't want to make this political by any stretch of the imagination, and I'll talk about alternative energy and all that, but let's just understand that oil's not just in gasoline. Oil's in plastics, it's in rubber. I mean, oil's in a lot of stuff. And so, as far as natural resources go, the refining, processing of it, as much as we use oil, water is dependent. If you are in an agricultural based society, you've got to be able to feed the flocks. You've got to, plants don't grow without water and sunlight. In an arid environment, you got all kinds of sunlight, problems with water. Um, the other thing too is that I've always found is interesting. If you look at the topography of this area, I mean, you don't think that there's a well there, right? I don't know, Michael, have you been out to like Arizona and Vegas, like our arid, the desert in the United States? I don't think, you know what, boys, if we dig down about 300 feet, I think we'll hit water. You don't expect that, but yet, because of the providence of God and the way he led Abraham through there, Abraham kind of dug several of these wells as he was going, and they become, throughout all of Old Testament history, they become a massive natural resource that are fought over, that are secured, that are protected, and as we're going to read about a little bit in just a minute, sometimes they're sabotaged.
Yeah.
So let's with some background, you kind of understand where we're at. Business principle number one is we've got to deal honestly and fairly, and if we don't, it will come back to destroy the relationship at some point. um, and sometimes that's irreparable. Sometimes it can be worked over, but the best policy, I think, in life and in general is always to be honest and in fair dealings, and especially in business. We had this conversation, I don't know, a couple of 3 podcasts ago with, when we got into, the sales side of the org chart, and, honesty doesn't necessarily mean you got to be, fully transparent with your pricing model or with proprietary insight. We're not going that far, but on some basic stuff like, hey, who's this woman you're with? Probably a good idea to be honest. Probably a good idea to come forward, especially when, I'm pretty sure sounds like it looked like a rerun to me, Michael. I don't know. You said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. But this looked like a rerun.
Yeah, it certainly resembles the account that we have of Abraham and Sarah, for the same excuse given. If they found out she's my wife, they'll kill me, and really the same characters. Abimelech, again, Abimelech being a title handed down to kings of the Philistines, but it's caused some commentators to think that this may be a mistake, or a same account that's being rewritten with different characters. But we know God in His providence has given us this example of good men who kind of fell into the same trap. Fear kind of caused them to be less than honest, and so Isaac, in his initial dealings here with these men of Gerar, and that's where he settles. He tells them that his wife Rebecca is his sister, and and Abimelech, they kind of buy that story, and so they're going around doing the thing, and Isaac's going about his day, and apparently Abimelech catches them in an intimate moment and says, "So what?" I said, "Are you weird, or are you lying to us?" And so the truth comes out, and
Both.
so and I don't. It's not. Moses, being the author here, doesn't make a clear connection between that event and the event of the wells, but it is interesting that they're back to back in the chronology, that he lists them back to back. And so, how much did the lie of Isaac plant the seed of distrust that kind of led to the conflict that we see later in chapter 26? Is I think at least something interesting to consider is that the Philistines didn't trust Isaac, and they were jealous of Isaac. We know that for certain. Well, were the seeds of that planted by Isaac himself? And that doesn't make the Philistines right, but it does mean that sometimes the consequences of our own bad decisions are what we have to deal with. I'm not sure that that's not the case here with Isaac to some extent.
Yeah, the one thing I'll double down on that too is throughout the course of Old Testament history, um, there is a lot of prejudice against the Hebrews anyway. I mean, everybody looks down on them or doesn't trust them. I mean, there is a ton of prejudice. We see that, as we talked about in the story of Joseph and his life. We see that when they're in Egypt, that they're looked down on. So, there's this mistrust. And listen, I'm not trying to give political commentary here, but you know, if people make, whether it be racist or, ethnic judgments, prejudgments, prejudices, uh, you know, to me, you almost have to be even more careful not to feed into them, right? If the prejudice is everybody from Pulaski County is a liar, you should probably go out of your way to be honest if you're from Pulaski County, right? I mean, I think some of that stuff you don't want to feed into, and of course, Isaac here, feeds directly into it, and no doubt that he'd heard the story about Abraham and Sarah, maybe had, that's where he got the idea. Obviously, his wife was in on it because she doesn't care to lie, that we know from her background. So, she had no qualms with being less than honest with the truth. But, for sure, when and here's the other thing, we talk about these back-to-back accounts. This did nothing to help that situation. It absolutely, hurt it. But this could have been really the beginning of this. Um, you know, Here you come in, you're dishonest. We're off on the wrong foot, and now you're doing better than us.
Yeah. So that's the next step in the narrative in verse 17 is, so that's where we've got to. Isaac is in this land. He's kind of sowed the seeds of distrust, but then he's really prospering. Verse 17, Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. So he's in a farming operation at this point, and he's been really blessed. And so the next step of the narrative is, it appears, if the chronology is a little bit tricky here, but it appears that the Philistines begin to start sabotaging his operation. If we allow Isaac to become too powerful, he is going to root us out of our own country, so to speak. And so they go in verse 15 and start filling in the wells with mud or with water. This is just sabotage. As I thought about it, as you were talking, what's the modern equivalent? If you wanted to kind of cripple my, and I bet your enterprise, you'd cut off the internet. That would be my so if you think these wells in terms of infrastructure, what was the infrastructure necessary to maintain Isaac's enterprise? Wells was part of that infrastructure. And so the Philistines were going out of their way to cripple his enterprise through sabotage. They cut his phone, they cut his internet line, so to speak. And very clearly in verse 16, they tell him to go away. Get away from us. You're much mightier than we. They're afraid of what Isaac has become. And so there is, I think, another scriptural lesson there. First of all, we already talked about, if you sow the seeds of distrust, you're going to reap some consequences from that. I think that we're seeing that. But secondly, success does breed jealousy, and the wind blows hardest on the top of the mountain. And so if you're blessed by God, and Isaac understood that's where his blessings came from, if you're blessed by God to be successful, there are some people who are going to be jealous of that. And how do you deal with that? And so I think that's something that Christians who are blessed to have some business success are going to face that, and they're going to face, as I'm sure Isaac did, some dishonest, what's the right word? There's going to be some things spread around about them that aren't necessarily true. They're going to be looked at in ways that's not favorable, and frankly, probably not fair. And what did Isaac do? Verse 17. So he departed from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. I don't. Again, we can talk about what was Isaac's motive for doing what he did. He didn't draw a line in the sand. He didn't fight over this land that he was going to be a sojourner in. He genuinely avoided the confrontation and kept the peace as best he could. And so is that a blight on Isaac's character? Or is that a business principle?
Oh, see now you go into meddling, asking tough questions. The interesting part about this is, and again, I don't know if Isaac being successful, if this conflict was unavoidable. Look, no matter what happened, is he's going to be successful. You're doing better than us, and you're an outsider.
Yes.
But I assure you, the lion didn't help. right?
Sure.
Because you've given them ammunition to, to your point. I think when success is going to breed some jealousy, but it's different whether you got ammunition or not. If you've left shells on the floor, it makes it a whole lot easier for your enemies to throw them at you. So I just kind of wanted to wrap that up. But, as we move forward, I think that principle is what Paul writes in Romans, as much as within you, be at peace with all men, and it just depends on what it means to keep the peace here. And maybe, as Isaac was looking around, that, listen, the only way we're going to have any kind of peace here is we move this operation down the road, and, we ain't worth fighting over. We can't fight over here. I can't, make a stand here and have any semblance of good being done. I don't know. I'm not, it doesn't say a lot about his motivations there, and, and kind of how he looks at this. But I think with all of us, trying to keep the peace first is probably a good answer. Sometimes you can't always do that. If you got into, you guys just build a brand new facility. If you got into it with your neighbors, it's not really feasible for you all to pick up and move at this point, right? You're going to have to figure out another way to keep the peace and get along with the neighbors. But if you're a sheep herder, sheep will follow you pretty much wherever you go, right?
Yeah, so that's an interesting point, and one that I didn't notice until a second reading is what did Isaac really have to sacrifice here? Because remember, we've already been told Isaac wasn't just a sheep herder, right? He was a farmer, and so what he had to leave was this land that had been really successful. I mean, this was for whatever way, in this well that he had found in this area that he was in, it had already returned 100-fold on his reaping what he had sown in this land. This was a successful venture that he walked away from.
But at the same token, they just got rid of your supply line, right? If you can't have water for the crops, the field's worthless anyway.
Yeah. So, what is the right way to view Isaac here? I think charitably, a thought would be, if Isaac has the same view of his interaction with Rebecca earlier in the chapter that I think we do, maybe in his mind he says, I kind of brought this on myself. I've been successful here and God bless me, but I brought this on myself with some of the dishonesty. And so if this is a natural consequence of that, I'm comfortable moving on, letting God bless me in the next place. Which again, it doesn't come right out and say that. That's a charitable reading, to be sure. You could certainly make the argument that he was just, kind of a softie and didn't want to fight. I'm not sure. That's probably too uncharitable. But somewhere in the middle,
I think that may be the middle ground there. I'm going to go the other way and say, I can't make any money here anyway, right? Like, you guys have ruined this enterprise. I'm going to leave, and you can take this field, but you're not going to make anything out of the field either. I almost, part of me wants to read it as, look, y'all got me. I'll take my, process and my sheep, and I'll just go do this somewhere else.
So I think that argument breaks down in the next paragraph when he does this again, and he opens up one of his father's wells in verse 18. And he is successful there. And the herdsmen, the Philistines, come and said, no, this is ours. And so not because the land wasn't good anymore, not for any evil intent, but he called the name of the well in verse 20, Esek, because they quarreled, and he moved and dug another well. And they contended over that one also. And so he moved and dug another well. And so it wasn't just the ones that they filled in, but even ones that they disputed about, he was willing to hand over and move on. And so, by the way, digging a well it ain't like it ain't like building a birdhouse. This is an undertaking.
It's an enterprise. Yes,
we're talking about. It wasn't like he called in the excavator, right? I mean, we're talking about some manual labor, getting a couple 100 feet underground. Probably, it's a significant undertaking that he goes through and then because of a dispute is willing to hand it over and walk away, and then another dispute and is willing to hand it over and walk away, until he gets to verse 22, digs yet another well. We don't know how many dry holes were dug, but this is at least the third successful well. And he called the name Rehoboth because the land has made room for us. There's finally room. There's a well that's not going to be quarreled over, and we shall be fruitful in the land. So there's this pattern of Isaac digging a well, the Philistines disputing, no, this is our land, so this is our water, and Isaac non-confrontationally or providentially, again, that's our challenge here, is to determine what his mindset was.
Right.
But he moves on to the next well, and so there is that righteous conflict peacemaking, or is it gutless confrontation avoidance? I think is, again, that is our challenge, to determine what the motive.
Right. And one thing, and again, I didn't notice this myself, kind of picked this up from one of the commentators, is not only are these wells, but they're what's called springing wells, meaning that, you got a spring underneath that's feeding this thing up. So you've got a constant supply of water, as opposed to you just hit a little pond underneath here, and when that pond's gone, it's gone. You've got a full spring that he's hitting. So interesting that, the definitely the change of tactics here from those of Guerrero and the Philistines, that, we're not plugging wells anymore. We want these are valuable resources. We don't want to kill the connection here. We want to prosper off of these things. So interesting too, that, in this, if we want to take the positive side of it, which is what Michael's usually on these calls for
charitable
sure.
readings.
Charitable readings.
That's how I want to be judged, and so that's how I'm going to judge Isaac.
So maybe that's it. He's going to keep the peace, and maybe his mindset is, God's blessed me with 3 wells so far. He's going to bless me with the 4th, right? The first one that they plugged, and then the 2 others that he dug. God's going to keep blessing me with wells, so I'm going to keep digging.
And he, he's already been told he's going to be a sojourner, and so maybe that's part of it too. Maybe it's part of the gig. I'm never going to have a permanent domicile. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe that's part of it. So if we want to be charitable on that side, the other side of it is, he is just maybe based on some guilt from the early interactions, that he's kind of running from this, and doesn't want to get into conflict, doesn't want to fight. I mean, obviously he's going to be outnumbered. He's by himself here in this land, right? So maybe he doesn't want to put the family in danger. Maybe he's, his herdsman he's trying to protect, and doesn't want to start a war here. So it's easier for him to pick up and move. This is one of the tough ones, because sometimes in scripture it tells us what our characters' motivations are and what the thoughts and intents of their heart are. The Holy Spirit will reveal those things. This is one of them where we're left to try to read into it. And, for sure, the business principle, I think, that we want to take away here is one, you're not always going to be rewarded for your first great idea. And oftentimes, your ideas, depending on the company or sometimes the university you work for, are the property of whoever is employing you at the time. There are, certain employment contracts and agreements that people have that, if you, especially I'm thinking with universities, if you discover something while we're paying you, then that's the property of the university, and we'll patent it and use it and whatever. And sometimes same within a corporation. I think that's part of the agreement with, like Google's and Facebook's of the world. If you discover a new code while we're paying you this salary, that's really ours. And you can't take that out and compete against us with it. So, there's part of that, that's in there. And I think sometimes we get frustrated. Well, this is my success and I'm being punished and I'm not able to reap my own success. That sometimes, we've got to go with idea 2 or idea 3, that our patience through very difficult circumstances that seem very unfair and are very unfair, not seem unfair. I don't want to be ungracious with that, but that, we if Isaac gets bogged down here like sometimes we do, we don't get to well 3 and 4, you know, and what we, you know, can kind of come to understand is Isaac's wells and the way he's prospering is going to benefit these folks for generations. And so he's supplying to, you know, a multiplicity of needs, and maybe that's part of God's providence is that's how he's going to take care of these other people, as well as the children of Israel, because, you know, famine's something that just seems to happen a bunch in this area, every so often. You know, we've got a famine's what brought him down here in the first place. You know, we got a famine coming with Joseph when he's in Egypt. You know, we got famines in the land that come in the time of the judges. So I mean, it seems like there's always a famine right around the corner, here for these things. So, you know, I said a bunch to try to say a simple point of we've got to be patient through our growing process, even when somebody else gets the credit for our work or benefits more than we do for our work. That patience through those trials will lead us out. And if we get frustrated, then we don't ever get to our third or fourth well that becomes our own.
Yeah, and you know, I think we should come back to the conflict in business point, and I think that might be a good one to just spend a little bit of time on in a minute. But the toward the end of the chapter, you know, however you think about Isaac's moves in regard to the Philistines and continuing to kind of move away from them, regardless of what you think about that, one thing I believe you have to give Isaac credit for is he kept digging, and I think that perseverance, if that's the right word, or just the move on to the next thing and keep digging. That I think that is no question that is not only a spiritual principle but a business principle. He kept digging. To your point, he did the work for those first 2 wells and didn't really reap the benefit. It didn't work out for whatever reason that line of product or that business venture or that division didn't work out, but he kept digging, and that never giving up. I mean, that is overly simplistic, and it's also pretty profound. Isaac just kept digging, and because of that, he ended up with these wells that kind of become the, as we already noted, this becomes one of the most famous places for generations in the land of Israel, Beersheba. And that well is named that because that Sheba, and we learned this, where is down in 27, 28, no, sorry, 33. He called that well Sheba because in the name of the city is Beersheba to this day, and Sheba means oath. So they made an oath there at this well. We never get to that if he doesn't keep digging. So that would be my kind of last principle there. Back to I think the key question, kind of the key business principle of this lesson of Isaac in the wells is, what do you do when there's conflict? What do you do when there's conflict in business? And you know, whatever Isaac did, I think he made a calculated, maybe even a calculated business decision. I mean, to your point, what was a war going to do to his enterprise? It was going to drag him into a conflict that he might win, but it was going to be costly. It was going to stop production. It was going
win,
to.
But what do you win?
Exactly. And was it just going to lead to a series of ongoing conflicts with other, you know, Philistine or native tribes in Palestine? You know, the sin of the Amorites was not yet full. This was not the generation that was going to overtake Canaan. And God has already made that clear. You're going to be a sojourner here. And so was it just going to lead to a series of conflicts and into a never-ending cycle of war with the native peoples? Did Isaac make a calculated personal and business decision that the cost of giving up these wells, even though it's difficult, even though it's painful and costly, is a calculated decision that I'll be blessed in the next thing and the juice isn't worth the squeeze to get into a skirmish with these people.
Is that original?
Oh no, nothing is original, man.
That's a new one for me. I haven't heard that before. Uh, this and I think that's a difficulty too. One of the principles that um, I alluded to a minute ago that I think is also important is, when you fight and when you have conflict, what what's your outcome that you're searching for? What do you win? I mean, if all these wells are lost, what'd you win? And what was your cost for what you gained in the end? you know when we go into any type of conflict, I don't care whether it's relationship conflict, business conflict within the church with the brethren. I think we got to take that deep breath and really count the costs here. you know what's this going to cost in emotional, physical, whatever value, and what am I going to gain? At the end of the day, if even if I get my way, even if I'm right, even if I come out on top, um, at what cost, and what did I really get here, and was it worth it? If we're frustrated in these capacities, we've got to be a little bit better with ourselves in terms of this. So tell a quick story on this. So many of you know that from time to time, especially when I'm tired and traveling, that I can be fairly ornery. So I'm flying back from a business trip through Chicago, which is always bad news for me. Every single time I go through Chicago, I get delayed. It's just, I don't know why. If I see Chicago on my itinerary, I just plan on spending the night. It's just going to be bad. Anyway, so we're flying through Chicago, get to Chicago at like 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm supposed to be home with my family by noon. Circa 9 o'clock that night, we're all packed in this gate. They get on the overhead comm and say, "Hey, good news is we found a flight that's going to get you guys home. It's going to leave here about 11. Bad news is it's on the complete other side of O'Hare. So everybody gather up your stuff and walk all the way to the other side of O'Hare." So we're walking and we've got a troublemaker amongst us, and it's not me this time, right? So this guy's going around, this is terrible. All of this, the way they've treated us is terrible. We should do something about it. And I mean, he's just like trying to start a mob is essentially what he's doing. So he gets to me and he starts his spiel. And of course, I'm tired. I spent a whole day in an airport, and I'm just ornery at this point. So I look him dead in the eye and I say, "You know what we should do? We should overthrow the pilot and steal the plane. We should hijack this whole thing. That's what we should do." He starts to look at me. I said, "Really? I mean, this is unfair. We should take matters into our own hands and overthrow the airport." He kind of starts backing away. And I'm like, "Man, what are you trying to do here?" I said, "What do you want to accomplish?" "I just want to get home. Like, if you want to be a jerk to these people, that's going to delay us getting home. I'm going to try to be nice. I want to go see my family. So unless we're going to hijack the airport and overthrow this and go full die hard, then would you sit down and shut up?" And so I tell the funny story for the point of what are we really trying to do? Like, are we, we can throw a fit, we can throw ourselves in the middle of the floor, and we can fuss about circumstances, or we can try to find the way out. How do I improve my situation instead of, going and doing something absolutely crazy and asinine? And as we look at, again, we struggle with the why, right? Does he have altruistic motives? Is he really relying on God's providence and care that, what, I'm going to keep digging and God's going to take care of this? Because that's the other part of this that I don't want to get away from on the keep digging side is we've got to be really, really honest with ourselves and with our lives about why we've gotten where we've gotten. And the principle that I, keep very much in the forefront of my mind is God's taking care of me to this point. I've got no reason to believe he's not going to keep taking care of me moving forward. I've got no reason to believe that. There's no reason I should stop digging, because as I've dug in the past, he's always made sure there was water. And if I dig in the future, he's going to make sure there's water. Now, I may not be digging in the same place, right? I may get picked up and moved from this place to the next, as as Isaac did. It wasn't like he just dug a well next door. They picked up and they walked and they went a while and then they dug again. And we may get moved around in our lives, but we'll end up where we're supposed to be. I'm fully convinced. And to God's providential care, He's going to put us in the place that we need to be, and we will be provided for and taken care of. And it may not be in the way that we think. You know, I can tell you, I've had conversations with people that have lost lucrative careers because of business situations or circumstances or whatnot, but found their family and what they were losing while they were out raising a fortune, right? And it's a shift that, are they as financially well off as they were before? No, but every one of them will tell you they traded and wish they would have done it 10 years ago, because they're making a living, they're paying their bills, but they're more engaged with their family than they ever were, or they're more engaged with the church than they ever were. They're more involved in working the kingdom. And what they thought was important left them empty and hollow, but now have found value in life. So, again, I'm not saying that we're always going to come up aces financially, because I think that's looking at scriptures wrong. We will always be taken care of, and the things that are the most important in life, we will have an opportunity to make a decision. But
Yeah.
we've got to
Well,
remember that it's God's care that gets us there.
yeah, well said. And, the guy who wonders why he gets stopped at airports is also the guy who's openly talking about overthrowing airports. So, I mean, you're on every watch list in the DMV. I mean, why are you being held up all these times? It's not really that big a mystery. The as you're talking there, it kind of becomes evident when you zoom out a little bit from the story of Isaac, that one of the reasons that we get into conflict is our own pride. And why, to your point, what is there to gain from this conflict? Sometimes it's just our pride doesn't want to lose.
Yeah.
If Isaac would have been a prideful person, he would have said, no, my reputation, it is what is, it's going to sully my name if I just
Right.
give up here.
Mm-hmm.
And so our own pride and our own reputation draw us into these conflicts that we can't win, or that there is no good outcome.
Right.
I think one of the positives about Isaac, even if you think that he is just a conflict avoider, and that just makes me like him, frankly, but even if you think that's a blight on his character, he didn't let his pride pull him into a conflict that he couldn't win. And I think that there is spiritual and business implications there, is that people who are egoless or prideless probably make humble. Yeah, exactly. Are probably better leaders and probably make better decisions. And, to think that these were easy decisions for Isaac is a gross oversimplification of the text, because this slides by quickly in a couple of paragraphs. We're talking about life-changing decisions for Isaac, picking up his whole family from somewhere that has been successful, and moving his whole, not only business, but personal operation from one place in the desert to another where they may or may not hit another well. This was not nothing. This was a significant, this was picking up his whole family and moving across the country. And each time that happened, I can't think that it was something Isaac took lightly. And how much did he talk to God about it? How much did he talk to his family about it? How much did he do this calculation of it? But again, to your point, he relied on God to bless him in the next place. He didn't let his pride drag him into a conflict he couldn't win, and he kept digging. And so that's why ultimately I like the story. Isaac is kind of an interesting character. He's not a military. His father was, Abraham was had the kind heart of a father, but also was a military leader and a successful business person. I mean, it was quite a legacy for Isaac to live up to, right, which is probably another angle that we don't even have time to tackle. But there was a legacy there that Isaac kind of lived in the shadow of, and he was a different kind of character. But think in this chapter in Genesis, we kind of see how he made his own way. He was successful, but he was pretty humble, and that there was definitely some reliance on God moving from place to place.
Yeah, and I think that's, the idea of servant leadership. Probably several of our listeners have read that book, The Servant Leader, and that's one of those key. We've got to have the humility to be honest about these situations, and that's really what it is. If I mean, imagine this scenario. You're working 70, 80 hours a week. You don't have work-life balance. You're miserable. um, you're struggling, and boss comes to you and says, you know what, Michael, you do a great job for us, we really appreciate it, we think we're really burning you out, so here's the deal, we're going to take off half of your responsibilities and get you out of here in a 45, 50 hour work week, but it's a 25% pay cut, and we're going to demote you to from a VP to an AVP, right? Do you get the things that you really, thought you wanted? Sure. Hey, I'm going to get some of my life back. It's not going to be as stressful. They took a bunch off of me. But how many of us swallow that? Like, I'm not losing my title. I mean, I worked hard for that title, and a 25% pay cut, I just can't swallow that either. Right? But so we're mad at the situation we're in because life's difficult. And yet when we are, given an out, our pride says, no, you can't take that out. So you end up in a lose-lose situation. And that's where, again, some humility to truly take that step back, take a deep breath, count the cost, and say, am I better off based on what I'm doing? Am I making, decisions based on that? And I think, while we're getting into subtext here, I guess maybe the careful way to say what we're doing here, parsing between verses. I think you can see that in the outcomes that, and there's probably, I mean, again, I don't think we're taking too big of a stretch to say, I don't think everybody moved with him every time, right? Because remember, he had vast servants, well, the only place they came from was they were, residents of the land, right? So as he's picking up and moving wells, there's probably good men, good families, good people that's working for him that said, you know what, I can't, my family's still here. I can't move with you to the next well. I can't go on the next venture. I've been with you for 2 of these, man. I can't go to the third. Or I've been with 3, I can't go to the 4th. So that's got to be difficult too when you leave behind, good employees. And sometimes, that happens. I know that's one of the more difficult things Michael and I've talked about throughout our careers is, you hate to lose good people. But sometimes that's the best thing for them and the best thing for you too, in the long run.
Yeah. So that kind of wound, or that study kind of wound around. But I think I like the place that we ended up. An interesting account there. Again, it's almost a choose your own adventure book. You kind of got to decide how you want to read it. But definitely some good lessons there. So we'll sign off there. I don't know what's next. Seems like we never know what's next, but there's always opportunities around the corner, my friend.
Absolutely. We'll keep looking for these deep cuts that maybe we haven't read too much of, and keep moving forward. But again, as always, thank you all for listening, for being a part of this. We appreciate the fact that you're out there. We appreciate the fact that you tune into us. And if you've got a character, one of these characters that, or stories that you think there's some principles there, please fire it to us. Text us, email us, leave us in the comments below, and we'll be sure to add them to the list as well. So we'll try to do this again inside of another week or so. But thank you for being out there. And we pray that you're safe and well in all your adventures.
God bless, my man.